India has had a very interesting history, particularly in terms of religion. So many religions came out of India, and often they have lived in peace and harmony. But occasionally there have been conflicts among these religions, and of all these conflicts, the one that takes the center stage is that of Hindus and Muslims. Of course, this has got to do much to do with how Islam arrived in India, especially in the northern part of India where there were a number of Islamic conquests. And that continued for a long period of time in the medieval ages. And India, which was Hindu majority throughout this time, was governed by the Islamic rulers, which was, of course, not pleasant all the time. So, given this history and this historical baggage, we see a lot of conflicts even today. In fact, the country Pakistan, which came out of India, and in fact Bangladesh, which came out of Pakistan, these countries were created for the Muslims of the Indian subcontinent. So it was this great divide between Hindus and Muslims, or Muslims and other religious communities, that has played out in different ways historically. Now, after the creation of Pakistan in 1947, there was a lot of optimism around the secular idea of India, and that probably the divide between the two communities, Hindus and Muslims, that would cease to exist. Of course, that hasn't happened. And we have seen, for whatever reasons, the divide still persists. I'm giving you this context because the book I've got today, it specifically talks about this issue. The book is called Being the Other, with the subtitle The Muslim in India. It was written by Saeed Naqvi, who is a veteran journalist and who in his lifetime has experienced different shades of India. When India got partitioned and new secular India was created, and how as a Muslim he felt then, and then new politics emerged, new ideas emerged, and today we have arrived at a different stage. So he talks about all these ideas one by one in the light of his own experiences, and then gives us a picture of what it means to be a Muslim in India, and how he's seen this socially and politically. So I'm going to narrate a few pages from his book, and these pages will give you a fair idea of what he's trying to tell you here. But of course, if you really want to understand all the narration and the stories, you need to read the book. For now, let me narrate these pages here. Here we go. I cannot put a date to exactly when it happened, but gradually, over many years, people around me began to identify me as Muslim. This was new, and I suppose the beginning of a process which placed me with the other. Firaq Gorakhpuri has a wonderful couplet to describe the phenomenon. It needed prescience, but we were growing lonely in a crowded world. In 1990, the late Vinod Mehta, distinguished editor, author of Lucknow Boy, and a friend of at least 60 years, beginning with school, invited me to write a column for his magazine from a Muslim perspective. I glared at him. "It too, Vinod?" We had grown up knowing each other's families enjoying the same food, books, movies, played sports on the same grounds, and waited on Saturdays with bated breath for the well groomed ladies of Isabella Thoburn College to troop onto the pavements of Hazratganj. Our differences, if any, were about Jeeves and Blanding's castle. We would argue about which sequence of books was funnier. And now, as editor, Vinod was slotting me with the other. In a sense, I suppose he was following a trend because of the way things had worked out after independence. If the country were to keep up the pretense of secularism and equality, it needed the other. Although those of us who belong to this category seem to be in short supply. In 1972, D.P. Dhar, as head of policy planning for the Indo-Pak Summit in Shimla that year, called up the editor of The Statesman, where I was working at the time, and asked that I be assigned to the hill station because we must have a bright young Muslim journalist in the Indian contingent. Pakistan President Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was bringing scores and they would all be Muslim. And that is how I got the opportunity to interview Benazir Bhutto, the 19-year-old undergraduate from Oxford who had accompanied her father. It was all splendid while the going was good. The thought never occurred to me then, as it does now, that there were larger implications to the way I lived my life and thrived in my chosen career. Jayaprakash Narayan, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, Inder Gujral, Pran Chopra, Inder Malhotra, Kuldeep Nair, and scores of others all extended patronage to me and quite rejoiced in it. The environments in which these worthies operated had very few Muslims. After partition, there was a dearth of enlightened Muslims. Secularism was still invoked, even though it was a declining ideal, having been much profaned. Another reality dawned on me. In a 50-year career, no Muslim had ever helped me strategically and for a good reason. After partition, Muslims seldom reached positions from which they could dispense favors. One or two who did were cautious, averse to helping members of their community. That would open them to the charge of nepotism or communal bias. A country emerging from layers of feudalism had necessarily developed a system of networks. For a time, caste networks ruled. Everyone was affected. The poorest Brahmin in Mustafabad or Rai Bareli was secure so long as Pandit Govind Vallabh Pant was UP's chief minister. That powerful network began to collapse as a huge churning overtook Indian society that will continue well into the 21st century. Groups and castes will find new levels, but given the current socio-economic condition of the Muslim, as spelt out by Sachar Committee, he is likely to be kept below the churning by his clerical leadership, which strikes bargains with the political class and keeps the community mired in religion in enclaves distant from modernity. And yet, it could have all been so different. In the course of the book, I have investigated the major missteps that took place after independence and pointed out in some instances how matters could have been better handled. But only rarely did the political and personal will of our tallest leaders rise above electoral sectarian considerations and their personal ambitions. If enough people in power had decided to take a different path, things would have been radically different. Of that I am convinced after decades of being an observer and citizen of the subcontinent. On the ground, people would have responded positively to the idea of coming together, even if strategic or other considerations had driven them apart. Let me illustrate this with an anecdote. I was a staff reporter with the Statesman when the war to liberate Bangladesh broke out in 1971. The editor, Ivan Charlton, advised against my covering the Bangladesh front because the militia there could mistake me for a Punjabi. That would be the end of me. So I was sent to Chamb in the western sector where there was no likelihood of an ethnic mix-up. Before I set out in my army uniform, my great aunt Nani Ammi took me aside. She gave me 2 talismans or Imam Zamins before I set off for the war front, one for me and one for Major Akhtar of the Pakistani army, a first cousin of mine who she thought I would meet during a break in the fighting. That is how hazy the project to divide the subcontinent was in many minds. Even today, I find it difficult to control my tears when I remember Nani Ammi standing in the doorway with 2 talismans for her grandchildren, one an Indian and the other a Pakistani. Why have our politicians, power brokers, ordinary citizens failed to reach out to bridge the divide between Hindus and Muslims? In Allahabad University, during the Babri Masjid, Ram Janmabhoomi agitation, I put a simple question to the packed audience consisting of teachers and students, almost equally divided between Hindus and Muslims. Have the Hindus in this audience ever seen the inside of a Muslim home? One or two murmured, "My father knew Persian," or "My mother cooks chicken," as evidence of his or her emancipation from religious parochialism. But no, none of them had ever been to a Muslim home. Likewise, the Muslims in the gathering had never visited a Hindu home. At that moment, a truth hit me between my eyes. We have lived in a state of uninstitutionalized apartheid for decades, even centuries. The segregation between people belonging to different religions has been complicated by the restrictions of caste. As we know, caste in this country is further stratified by the clan you belong to. At the very top of society, with a few exceptions, you are segregated by class and not necessarily by caste. But at other levels, it becomes progressively oriented towards caste. There is little crossover and there are often atrocities perpetrated by higher castes upon lower castes. New converts to Islam imagined they had broken away from these stratifications towards a more egalitarian system. Indeed, in the congregational system of Islam, they could all enter the mosque. As the poet Iqbal said, Mahmud of Ghazni and his slave stood shoulder to shoulder in prayer. The mosque, madrasa, and the marketplace became centers for social mobility. But even this apparently egalitarian system could not escape stratification, albeit larger ones. Ashraf, Ajlaf, and Arzal, elite weavers and middle craftsmen, and the menials. As we have seen, Sir Syed Ahmad's Aligarh Muslim University was meant only for Ashraf, consisting of Saids, Pathans, and Sheikhs or converts from Hindu upper castes among the Hindus. It is against this background that my interaction with the faculty and students in Allahabad must be seen. That we have stopped visiting each other's homes should not be taken literally. Although there could be much greater interaction between the two communities, especially in the cities. In rural areas, there was greater interaction in public spaces. A contrasting situation comes to mind. In the South African apartheid system, there were 3 clear-cut enclaves for whites, Indians, and blacks. The separation was enforced by the state. In India, separation is enforced by ancient custom and social habit. If there has been no culture of social interaction across caste and subcaste lines, contacts across communal lines have been even more restrictive, except at a rarefied level where, as I've mentioned, class trumps caste and community. Yet, even in North Indian Muslim enclaves where hierarchies were determined by class, these class divisions could be overcome by a shared Urdu culture. In other words, especially up to the 20th century in North India, familiarity with Urdu poetry, music, a knack for clear diction and witty conversation ensured entry into most social circles. Religious identity was dwarfed by personal civility and culture. It was like joining a gentleman's club in London's Pall Mall. You could be of any make or color, but you had to be clubbable, interesting, able to speak proper English. It was sometimes more important to be interesting than to be relevant. In these social enclaves, as we have seen in the book, the secular turf was extensive and accommodative motifs of an infinite variety. Poetry, music, folklore, diction, mythology, Braj Bhasha, Avadi, stretching down to the village fairs where intense cultural cross-fertilization took place. This is how the tapestry of Awadh's composite culture was woven. Kashmiri Pandits and Kayasthas, enthusiastic participants in Urdu culture, were regular visitors to Muslim homes. The Muslim as the other hit home particularly hard one day in 1996 when our maid Ganga asked my wife to join her in the kitchen to talk about something in private. The Indian cricket team was then in the quarter-finals of the ongoing World Cup. She said, "My husband and I they were watching TV last night and wondered which team you and Sahib favored." My wife, a teacher by instinct and profession, patiently explained the story of partition and how there were many more Muslims in India than in Pakistan. Meanwhile, Rangili, the young girl who helps Ganga, teased Jamil, our driver, that your team has lost. Jamil, never short of birds, shot back, "If it is my team which has lost, then the captain of your team is a Pakistani." The Indian cricket team captain at that time was Muhammad Azharuddin. This completely foxed Rangili, who marched off to Ganga's quarters, complaining that Jamil had described the captain of the victorious Indian team as a Pakistani. Jamil was in the dock. Ganga, who is a Nepali from Darjeeling, embarked on a mock trial of Jamil. Her husband Jagdish joined in. "But are you not a Muslim?" Rangili asked cheekily. "Yes, but not a Pakistani," Jamil replied. "Muslims are Pakistanis," Rangili persisted. "Azharuddin is also a Muslim," Jamil said. My wife furnished more data. Azharuddin, who received an award as captain of the winning team, is a Muslim. Sidhu, the man of the match, is a Sikh. Vinod Kambli, who hit a century in the previous match, is a Christian. Ganga eyed my wife suspiciously. "You mean the Hindu did nothing?" My wife was beginning to lose patience. An Indian team is an Indian team. There are no Muslim or Hindu teams in our country, she asserted. Ganga found this illogical. If the Pakistani team is a Muslim team, why should the Indian team not be a Hindu team? Ganga's logic gave Jamil yet another opening. If you want a Hindu team, you cannot have Azharuddin as captain. Jagdish intervened aggressively. If having Azharuddin as a captain means that we cannot have a Hindu team, we should not have him as a captain. This angered Jamil. Who are you to remove Azharuddin? In fact, you should shut up because you are a Nepali. But I am a Hindu, Jagdish continued. Does a Nepali Hindu have more rights in India than an Indian Muslim? Jamil asked, fuming. The conversation came to an abrupt end when the doorbell rang and our friend Anoop entered. For the past few days, He had been drawing up plans for us to travel to Lahore to see the World Cup finals in March 1996. Provided, of course, India made it to the finals. Anup was in a state of high agitation. "Have you seen all this?" he asked, thumping the chest set of newspapers on my table with the back of his hand. "They've gone crazy in Pakistan. The country's Senate has asked for an inquiry into the Pakistani defeat at Bangalore. Wasim Akram's house has been stoned. Jamaat-e-Islami says so long as the country was ruled by a woman, Benazir Bhutto, Pakistan would keep losing." Anup paused, then continued his soliloquy. "They are treating a cricket defeat as a national humiliation. I suppose they have nothing else through which they can define their nationalism." He waited for me to react, then asked, "So, what do you think?" I was busy reading the astonishing stories from Pakistan, how the nation was in convulsions after losing the Bangalore match. "I refuse to go to Lahore under these circumstances," Anup said. He said his friends at ITC who had offered him passes for the Lahore match, they were having second thoughts themselves. There would be a small Indian group at the Gaddafi Stadium. "They may attack us, they may even kill us," Anup added. Ironically, Anup's somewhat exaggerated anxieties were set at rest by the turn of events at Eden Gardens, where India was saved the agony of having to face hostile crowds at Lahore because of their loss to Sri Lanka in the semi-finals. The high pedestal of self-righteousness on which we stood after Bangalore came crashing down after Calcutta. The Calcutta crowds were the great leveler. They set fire to the stands at Eden Gardens. Indo-Pak relations, which had touched rock bottom following Pakistan's defeat, were on an even keel again. Diplomacy would have had to struggle for months to achieve what the Sri Lankan cricketers and the Calcutta crowds did in a day's therapeutic cricket. And they did it so convincingly that the Pakistani overreaction in their country was confined to the newspapers. The final words to Anup were mine. "Now, nobody will notice a group of Indian fans in Lahore. So Anup, call up your friends and hit the road to Wagah and watch some decent cricket free of Indo-Pak tensions." India, Pakistan and Bangladesh are permanent realities. These cannot be wished away. The cancer that partition left behind cannot continue to claim hearts and minds and lives. In chapter after chapter, we have seen how the complex triangular reality of India, Pakistan, Hindu-Muslim, New Delhi, Srinagar, must be grasped. Tinker with any one axis and it will have an immediate impact on the other two. And yet, no concerted effort is being made to take a holistic view of the triangle, understand it, and order our behavior according to its imperatives.